Okay, hi. My name is Sue Butler, and I am a program planning co-chair for the ABC League of Women Voters. And I'm very proud tonight to introduce to you Nick Harper. Nick works for the State League of Women Voters. He is the Civic Engagement Manager. Nick went to his undergraduate school at Gustavus Adolphus, his graduate school at the University of Iowa. He is an attorney, passed the board, the bar, and the whole 9 yards. We're very happy to have him with us tonight. He has some expertise in our topic, which is money in politics. And as if you have questions, if you just want to write on your little cards, and then we'll pass them in, and he will answer them. So, Nick, thank you.
Thank you so much. Just to give, I'm really excited. Thank you for having me here tonight. I'm excited to talk about one of my favorite topics, money in politics. So my plan for us, I broke my presentation up tonight into about 4 parts. The first part is kind of just a quick background on the legal grounds, like how we got to where we are today on money in politics from a legal perspective, because the legal perspective is really the foundation for the practices and what happens today in our politics. And then I wanted to discuss quickly a couple of national trends that have come up lately. Then I wanted to do a quick overview of Minnesota's system for campaign finance and what makes us specifically different. And then go over a couple of current events happening here in Minnesota that involve money in politics. So, let's get started. Let's start with a background of law. So the first case that really is modern campaign finance is Buckley versus Vallejo in 1976. This case interpreted the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971, which was the first attempt to create the Federal Election Commission and kind of monitor money and how it was used in politics. Buckley versus Vallejo was the case where anytime you hear someone who says money is speech, this is the case that they're referring to. Sometimes people get confused and say that it was Citizens United or another case, but this is where it started. Was Buckley versus Vallejo. In that case, they said that speech depends on money, and therefore regulations on money for speech purposes is subject to the exacting scrutiny of the First Amendment. So, long story short, when you spend money in order to talk about a political issue, whether it be a candidate, for example, which was at issue here specifically, you typically spend money to do those kinds of things. You'll buy an ad, you'll print things, you'll mail things to people. That all is speech, and it does cost money. So the court's analysis was that while speech is not necessarily money in and of itself, to clarify, speech relies on money in such a way that the regulation of speech is in some form a regulation, or the regulation of money is in some form a regulation on speech. So that is what the Buckley case held. How the court put it was, the quote that I have here is that a restriction on the amount of money a person or group can spend on political communication during a campaign necessarily reduces the quantity of expression by restricting the number of issues discussed, the depth of their exploration, and the size of the audience reached. So that was the key phrase, like the key sentence that really sums up Buckley versus Vallejo, or at least this part of Buckley and versus Vallejo. There were a lot of issues, but this is the key one that kind of influenced all money in politics issues for the Supreme Court afterwards. They also focused on corruption or the appearance of corruption as being the justification for these regulations on speech. That obviously the First Amendment is a very important right that we value very strongly here in the United States. But the justification for some burden to justify the burden there is the corruption or appearance of corruption, to fight actual bribery or even the perception of there being bribery. So this was where the court first talked about speech being dependent on money, and then also the justification on regulating money, speech and money. This was kind of the birthplace of modern campaign finance law. Now the big one that everyone loves to hate, Citizens United. And I'm actually going to talk also about Speech Now, and I will explain more on that in a second. But Citizens United, everyone is very well aware of. If you care at all about money in politics or know anything about it, you've probably heard about Citizens United. Citizens United was the case that the Supreme Court held that the federal government cannot treat a corporation differently for First Amendment purposes just because it's a corporation. In that case, they were discussing the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002. That act was primarily passed in order to address some of the issues in Buckley, but also some kind of loophole activities that had been happening over the past years. And so they had passed the BICRA Act in order to close those loopholes, in a sense. Citizens United was controversial, not only just because of the holding, people disagreed with it, but the Supreme Court actually overruled itself, which is a very rare thing to do. They overturned first they overturned Austin versus Michigan Chamber of Commerce, which was a case that held that essentially it talked about the perception of corruption and the distorting influence of corporate dollars on elections. So they overturned that case entirely, and then they also overturned parts of McConnell versus FEC. So because that's such a rare occurrence and really doesn't happen very often, that's part of the reason it was so big. The reason that people love to hate that case is because it really did kind of solidify the idea that corporations are people. Now, that's a really oversimplified way of putting it, and I want to be clear. I'm going to go all these cases. I'm vastly simplifying them because I don't have time to go into them, but like Citizens United, for example, had over 178 pages of court opinion attached to it. So I've been doing a really quick simplified version. So the court decided that you can't discriminate on First Amendment basis just because it's a corporation, but not only that, the court decided that independent spending, which is you can spend in coordination with a candidate, talk about what you're going to do, what kind of ads you're going to run, who you're going to run the ads for or against, what target audience you're going to aim for. But you can also do independent spending, which is where you, with no discussion whatsoever, or any kind of coordination with the candidate, spend money in favor or against a candidate. That's called independent spending. And the court's reasoning was that because it's independent, because it's not at all discussed with the candidate, it can't be corruption or appearance of corruption. I think many people disagree with that analysis, but that has kind of been the starting point for kind of the big wave of change in campaign finance law since Citizens United. So the summary is there that the corporations can spend money on politics. And when I talk about corporations, I don't just mean corporate PACs, which are political action committees that the either shareholders or officers of a corporation donate to, but the corporate treasury itself can spend money on a political advertisement or an electioneering communication. So that is kind of the sum of Citizens United. Now, Speech Now is the case that happened just a few months after Citizens United. Citizens United is like the big sibling that definitely is known for being the troublemaker. Speech Now is the younger sibling that everyone forgets is also a huge troublemaker. Speech Now is actually the case that created unlimited spending. That is the case that created super PACs, where you can raise an unlimited amount of money and then spend an unlimited amount of money on independent expenditures. So that was what happened. That's really the case that actually created super PACs, which is the big criticism for most people. So that's where we got not only that corporations are people, but then also that certain political action committees that spend independently can spend and raise an unlimited amount of dollars, which is why there's so much money in politics. If we have questions, please use the cards. That way I can read them. And I promise I will go back to them. So I do want to, there are two more cases that are relevant to modern campaign finance law. They're not related, but I put them on the same slide. The first one is Bloomin. So we do have laws here in the United States that essentially prohibits any foreign national, which is an individual who is not a US citizen, essentially, from directly or indirectly making a contribution or a donation of money or anything of value for any federal, state, or local election. And then they also can't spend money on an independent expenditure. The idea, this was challenged in Bloomin versus the FEC, where there was a lawful permanent resident who lived and worked in the United States, planned to be here for a long time, but was not yet a citizen. They challenged this prohibition on making contributions or spending money. And what happened is it went to the DC Circuit Appellate Court. And that court held that, and I'll read the quote to you, "It is fundamental to the definition of our national political community that foreign citizens do not have a constitutional right to participate in, and thus may be excluded from, activities of democratic self-government." So the real key here for Bloomin is that here in America, American elections are for Americans only. That the whole point of a political system and for not only political speech but also elections is democratic self-governance. And we are allowed to exclude foreign nationals because they are not part of that government, that self-governing body. Now, the argument that Bloomin tried to make here was that you can't discriminate against a corporation because of its identity. Why do you get to discriminate against a foreign citizen for their identity? The Supreme Court did not buy that, and actually they summarily affirmed the case. They actually did not write their own opinion, which is kind of unusual. They just outright said the lower appellate court was right, period. Just like refer to that case, which is pretty unusual. Usually they try to write some of their own response, but they did not do that in Bloomin. And that'll become important later on when we talk about foreign money and influence in the national level. So the next case is McCutcheon. In that case, I'm only going to mention very briefly, but it also has to deal with the amount of money in politics that we have today. That case was in 2014. There used to be an aggregate limit on the amount that an individual could donate to all candidates or committees. So you could spend, I can't remember what the number is off the top of my head, but it was something like $70,000 to any candidates, and then $20,000 to any party committees. So about $90,000 to $100,000 total is the amount that you could spend in any given election. The Supreme Court knocked that down. So you can give an unlimited amount overall, the aggregate amount. You're still limited to a maximum per candidate or per committee, but your overall maximum among all committees is not maxed out. Now, part of this, there were a couple of justices that dissented in this case because their point was, well, you could just set up 20 different political action committees, and then you would be able to give the maximum to each political action committee, and then those action committees could all donate to the same candidate or something like that. And they essentially said that there would be an influx of millions of dollars. Several of the justices said, no, that's ridiculous, hypothetical, that will never happen, and then lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. I will say, however, that Citizens United, and I think also McCutcheon, if I'm remembering correctly, for being so terrible for campaign finance reformers, they did have a couple silver linings, or one silver lining, and that is that they did affirm that it is lawful to require disclosure for campaign spending and campaign contributions. So you can always go to the FEC website and see who spent what money on what elections, and see who made how much money a certain candidate is receiving, and if it's above a certain amount, who actually gave them money. So that is the silver lining to those storm clouds on campaign finance reform. So that is the the quick overview of the legal background of how we got here today, of how we got to money is speech, kind of. Corporations are people, kind of. You can spend unlimited amounts of money independently as long as you're not a foreign national. That's kind of the quickie version of where we are. So now let's talk about the national trends that are happening like right now. There are two that I want to talk about. The first one being, of course, the general dissatisfaction with money in politics. I'm sure many of you have heard over the years that there is a strong majority of Americans who do not like money in politics. Lo and behold, that's still that way. In the fall of 2017, the Washington Post commissioned a poll on a couple of different issues, but one of them included money in politics. And 65% of Americans think that money in politics is a lot to blame for causing the dysfunction in the United States politics, and that 98% think money in politics is at least somewhat to blame. So that's 98% of Americans think that money in politics is somewhat to blame for the political dysfunction in America. So the general populace is not a fan of money in politics. I will also say that there was also a Center for Public Integrity did a poll at late summer of 2017. They also found that 57% of Americans want limits on super PACs, and that includes 60% of people who identify as independents, 51% of people who identify as Democrats, and 48% of Republicans who opposed Citizens United. So it is pretty broad, and while it varies somewhat among the parties, there is pretty strong support among various political identities. So the general populace is not satisfied with the current system of money in politics, and that is not only, it goes up among broadly against various political identities. What about the candidates themselves? Lo and behold, they also hate it. As it turns out, the national parties suggest that each representative in the House of Representatives or senators spend at least 30 hours per week fundraising. Now, assuming you work a regular 40-hour job, which is not going to happen because you're in Congress, but pretending, that's 3/4 of your time. That only leaves you 10 hours to do not only constituent services, but also lawmaking. And then if you're running for office again, you've got to find time to actually do the actual campaigning, not just the fundraising, but like the rallies and whatnot. So that's a lot of time. There is, and this is not a criticism that's based only in one party. There are members, both current and former representatives and senators from both parties who are critical of the current money in politics system and its reliance on large dollars. There is one former representative in Florida who has been quoted as saying, your first responsibility is to make sure you hit $18,000 a day. $18,000 a day in fundraising. And that is former Representative David Jolly from Florida. He's no longer a representative. I would say primarily because he doesn't want to spend $18,000 a day fundraising. He wants to be able to actually pass good laws and help his constituents. Unfortunately, the way that money in politics is set up is in order to reach any of that policymaking, you first must make enough money to ensure that you remain elected. So it's kind of a terrible system. Nobody really wants it. So that's where we're at. I want to just clarify just up-to-date numbers, and that it's general dissatisfaction among many political identities, among the general populace, but also across the aisles for the elected officials themselves. I also want to talk a little bit about foreign money and influence, because that's kind of been a hot topic over the last year or so. Especially after the 2016 election, there was an increased scrutiny on the possibility of foreign actors or money influencing online election advertisements. Specifically, social media came under a huge amount of fire. Facebook and Twitter being the biggest two, also Google, which is not really social media but is a search engine. Facebook came under specific fire because they so as we went over earlier, you can't buy an ad to influence an election if you are a foreign national. And it came out that there might have been some ads that might have been bought by foreign actors to affect elections. And Facebook, the social media company, said, well, we didn't really know. It's not really our fault. We didn't know that they were. And of course, lo and behold, at least one transaction was actually paid with Russian rubles. So after that nonsense, Senator Klobuchar and Senator McCain, a bipartisan effort, decided to co-sponsor the Honest Ads Act, which is Senate File 1989. That is a change to the way that we track online election advertisements. But it's not a huge change from what we do already. We already require that TV, media, newsprint, and radio all track the amount of time and money that is purchased for election advertising. Who buys it, how much they spent on it, how much time or space did they buy. The Honest Ads Act does the same exact thing except for internet. It simply brings our disclosure and disclaimer laws up to date for the 21st century, brings us into the digital age. Now, I want to point out that for many individuals, especially conservatives who care about the issues of money in politics, they focus on this issue not only because it's a national priority for democracy and self-governance, but also because it is a national security issue. There are many individuals who recognize the influence of foreign money in politics can influence our domestic policy and our foreign policy in such a way that will affect our national security. In the same way that the United States has in some ways influenced other democracies or other governments across the world, it is now happening to us. And that is not a partisan statement. That, I think, that was recently affirmed by the Secretary of State, who is a Trump appointee and part of President Trump's cabinet. So that's not a crazy partisan thing to say. That is an actual thing that has been affirmed by the Secretary of State, as well as current and former national security officers. Now, what's really sad here is that the Federal Election Commissioner, Ellen Weintraub, actually pushed this issue in September of 2016. She warned us about this. If you ever heard the Greek myth, now I can't remember her name, but there's a Greek myth of a woman who she's cursed to tell the truth, but everyone believes that she's telling a lie. Cassandra, thank you. Commissioner Weintraub is our Cassandra of election law. She told us that this was going to happen, and to some credit, also, of course, her fellow and former colleague, now former commissioner, Ann Rabel, who also discussed this issue of money in politics. But they both said, this is going to be an issue. You're going to have money in politics. We need to keep an eye out for this. Her colleagues on the commission did not take her up on that issue. And then lo and behold, all these things come out. So finally, the FEC voted in November of 2017 to start considering drafting some new rules approaching internet ads. So it's perhaps a little late, but better than never, I suppose. She specifically wrote, and I just want to point out that she specifically wrote in her letter to her colleagues, "Our courts have said that foreign money may be barred from our elections. Congress has said that foreign money must be barred from our elections. The American public has the right to expect the Federal Election Commission to ensure that foreign money is barred from our elections. To fail to do so is to threaten the integrity of Americans' political institutions and thus this national security of America herself." So that is kind of the framework of where we're at right now in terms of money and foreign influence on our elections. I bring that up only because it is such a hot topic, and I know that we will continue to hear about it, especially since just last week, Secretary of State did make a similar statement that there will be continued Russian attempts on influencing elections in America. So let's switch to Minnesota. Let's focus down on Minnesota specifically. So here in Minnesota, there are three things that make us unique from other states. The first one is that we have a campaign finance and public disclosure board. Now, this isn't super unique. This is actually fairly similar to the FEC at the national level. But the campaign finance and public disclosure board is split between 3 Republicans and 3 DFL individuals. But any action must take an affirmative 4 votes. So by definition, it must be a bipartisan act. There's no pushing things through on a partisan basis that we sometimes see in the legislature. So that's kind of the safeguard of preventing against partisan action or politically motivated action. The duties of the Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board are to receive campaign finance reports and to facilitate public disclosure of those reports. It also implements our public subsidy program, which we'll go over in a minute. It also interprets statutes and rules as necessary, because the statutes are not always 100% clear. And they also, of course, enforce the campaign finance rules and laws, including implementing fines as necessary. So they are pretty similar to the Federal Election Commission at the federal level, but here locally. It's just a nice way to make sure that things are done appropriately and without a partisan motivation. So the next part of our system here in Minnesota is we have a public subsidy program. So what happens with the public subsidy program is that candidates are not required to volunteer or to participate. If they don't want to participate, they may raise and spend unlimited amounts of money. But if they want to participate, they are limited in the amount that they can raise, but they receive a subsidy or a grant from public funds. So they don't have to spend as much time raising money. They don't have to go to big donors. They reach a certain number of small donors, a certain amount from a number of donors, and then they're able to use some public funds in order to subsidize their campaign. Now, why do we do this? Because there are some arguments that, well, why are taxpayers subsidizing politicians? But to be clear here, this is not a subsidy for politicians. This is a subsidy for democracy. This is a subsidy for small donors, for everyone who can't afford to spend several $1,000s on a candidate or promoting a candidate. So it's a nice program that helps support the everyday Minnesotan who can't spend a lot in big money in politics. I also do want to point out that historically, almost all candidates from both major parties have participated. So let's see, I looked at the last couple of election cycles. In 2016, it was 85.5%. In 2014, it was 88.5%. In 2012, it was 85%. And in 2010, it was 89%. So a pretty strong 85 to 90% of candidates participate in the public subsidy program. So there's no saying that it's a partisan activity because almost everyone does it. Everyone participates in this program that benefits their constituents and also their campaign, so they spend less time raising money and more time actually speaking to constituents. We also have a political contribution refund program. The political contribution refund program applies to the parties or to candidates who have participated in the public subsidy program. In that situation, the state will, what happens is you will make a $50 contribution or two $25 contributions or any iteration thereof to a state party or a candidate who is working with the public subsidy program. The state will then refund up to $50 per calendar year per eligible voter. So that means you essentially can give $50 to a candidate or to a party of your choice for free, because that money will be reimbursed to you from the state. Again, this is another program that increases the number of small dollar donors and reduces the reliance on large donors. It also increases a broad base so that there are many, many donors rather than being a few donors. So it is, in a sense, democratizes the money in politics through this system as well. The political subsidy program, the political contribution refund program, I do not believe they are entirely unique, especially the public subsidy program, are not entirely unique to Minnesota, but Minnesota, because of our combination and for our great civic engagement and voter turnout, we have been nationally recognized as a model for campaign finance reform in other states. Now, we still have some work to do. There's always a little bit of tweaking and cleaning up we can do here in Minnesota, but we should still be very proud that we are one of the, a nationally recognized model that other states can use in order to improve their own campaign finance systems within their own states. So now I want to go into a couple of local current events that are happening that are here in Minnesota, rather than just focusing on a federal level. So local elections. I want to talk about the Minneapolis City Council elections that happened last fall, because a lot of the times when we're talking about money in politics, a lot of the times we think of, we're talking about, senator for U.S. Senate. We're talking about big stuff. Or sometimes we're talking about, like the state legislature. People forget that this can also apply at the local level in your city council, even your school board. So the example I have here is that there was one political fund that originally they had raised $112,000. 60,000 of that came from a single donor. Then a political action committee came in and dumped an additional $140,000 into that fund. And using that money of, if I can do the math, I think that's almost $250,000, tried to elect preferred candidates in the Minneapolis City Council. Now, to their credit, that's all legal. That's the whole point of the system. It's set up that way. That's all, nothing wrong with that in the sense that it's totally legal. But I want to point out that this is a method where large dollars have been applied at the local level, and a small number of donors have been attempted to influence the local level elections. Another interesting point here is that the big dump of $140,000 into the fund was done right after the pre-election disclosure was required to be done, so it was essentially unknown until after the election was done. So no one knew who was funding these advertisements until after the election was over and the people had already been elected. I also want to point out that it's especially difficult for local elections because, with the FEC, there's lots of, they have a database that you can access online. And the FEC, to their credit, works really hard to make sure that that database is updated at all times. There is also the State Campaign Finance Board also has a database where you can search and check for to see who is fundraising how much money and who their donors are and whatnot. When you get to the local level, it's a bit more difficult because the campaign finance for the Hennepin County races are administered by Hennepin County, and it doesn't have the same capacity that the FEC or the State Campaign Finance Board has. So they publish their reports in PDF format rather than a database. So if you're, for example, a reporter who wants to say who's been donating to who and how much did they spend, you actually have to go through and do all of that analysis by hand or somehow be able to pull that data from the PDF in order to do that analysis. So there is disclosure, but it's just really hard to actually look at what that data says. So there's an additional difficulty with local elections. And I'm not trying to blame Hennepin County here because it does have some capacity issues. But if reformers are looking for a way to ensure more disclosure, which I said the Supreme Court has always said is totally legal, this would be one way to improve that disclosure. Special legislative elections. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about this, and I'm not going to go into any details, but this is another issue where that's happening literally today about money in politics. So, as you may know, there is a special election happening today for Senate District 54, and there has been a lot of money poured into that election as well. So there's actually a Star Tribune article from yesterday. Cash pours into 2 Minnesota special elections. One of them is the House district that former Representative Tony Cornish was in, but I want to talk about specifically Senate District 54 because if you've read the news lately, there's kind of a legal argument about whether or not Senator/Lieutenant Governor Fishbach may keep her seat. While we were eating dinner over the last hour, the court actually made a judgment on that, but I am 99% sure that that will be appealed, so don't assume that's over. But the point is that depending on the outcome of that lawsuit and depending on the outcome of the special election, there could be a split in the Senate, 33 DFL to 33 Republican. And so the balance of power of the Senate depends on that lawsuit and this special election. And because it's such a high, kind of a high risk or high reward, it's been getting a lot of some national attention, but also a lot of monetary attention. So as of January 29th, the candidates together had raised over $120,000 just for this special election alone. And I also want to point out that like the problems with local elections with disclosure issues, special elections are so short and are so unusual that disclosure for special election independent spending, again, is not reported until the election is over. So there's those problems where the disclosure has not caught up with the actual election process itself. So again, it can happen not only in the state legislature generally, but also has some additional problems when you're getting into special legislative elections or extremely high intensity elections. a quote from that Star Tribune article is that the candidate said that they have knocked on doors for months, that people have kept telling them that they want a senator who works across the aisle. Meanwhile, political action committees and special interest groups are mailing attack ads with less than bipartisan messages. So my point there is that money in politics affects not only, of course, who gets elected, but also affects the actual discourse itself. That there are, the tendency is that individual voters want to have people who will walk across the aisle and compromise, but the attack ads that happen in independent expenditures are not nearly as nice. So it changes not only the election outcome, but also the election civil discourse or lack of civil discourse that happens. So that's all the hot information that's happening today in Minnesota. But I do want to go over a couple more pieces with the going with 2017 and beyond. So, as you all probably know, there is a governor's race happening. There will be electing a governor and lieutenant governor in 2018. In 2017 alone, the candidates running for governor raised $3.25 million. And that was just in 2017 alone. We still have the rest of 2018 to get through. You also have probably heard that we have a race over the Senate seat formerly held by Senator Al Franken, now held by Senator Tina Smith, and her challenger is Karen Housley. They together have raised over $300,000 in the last couple of months, and that, of course, is going to explode over the next couple of months as we get closer to the election. And Minnesota is going to be crazy, especially for money in politics, because we are considered a kind of a hot toss-up state. This fall, there will be 435 U.S. House elections. 21 of them are considered toss-ups by political analysts. 4 of those are in Minnesota. So we are a very purple state with very purple districts. And because there is more likelihood of either loss or success, depending on who you are, and because it's more competitive, there's more at risk. And because there's more at risk, there's going to be pouring more money into those districts in order to ensure that the candidate of that preference is elected. So I think that based off of this information, I would think that Minnesotans should really prepare themselves for a lot of independent spending. They're going to see a lot of ads and a lot of mailers about candidates running for Congress. So be prepared. It's going to happen this year. So that is kind of a run-through of what I have for you all today. If we have questions, it looks like, I will go over those. Campaign Finance Commission. If a third or more parties achieve major party status, will they also be seated on the commission? I cannot for the life of me remember over FEC, but I believe it's also the same as the state. And the state campaign finance board, the legal language is technically no 3 can be of the same party. So you could technically have 2 DFL, 1 Green Party, 1 Independence, and 2 Republican. Now, the practical aspect of it actually happening is like 0. Because the people who go to the campaign finance board and sit on that board have to be appointed by the governor, who will always be one of the 2 major parties, and then typically are supposed to be approved by the Senate. So then you also have to get approval from that house, or from that chamber of the legislature as well. So technically they could be, but the likelihood of that happening based off the politics of the major parties controlling the 2 decision makers there would be that it's unlikely that that would happen. Do you ever anticipate that the Supreme Court will overturn Citizens United and or speech now? Not in my lifetime. I mean, I'm not going to say it's never going to happen, but based off of the current makeup of the court and the likelihood, I mean, you'd have to have a fairly significant change of at least 2 conservative justices leaving the court and being replaced with more, I don't want to say liberal because that's really not what I'm going for here, but two justices who disagree with Citizens United jurisprudence and not only disagree, but felt so strongly about it that it was so incorrect and so wrong interpretation of the Constitution that they would say that it was wrong. Because typically what happens, and this is part of the reason that Citizens United is such a big deal, is justices will remain on precedent. Stare decisis is what the lawyers call it, because we like our fancy, ugly Latin words. Stare decisis. Essentially, it means stand by the decision. So that means whatever was decided stays decided that way unless there's a really good reason to overturn it. And so in Citizens United, enough justices decided that there was a really good decision to overturn it. In order to overturn Citizens United or speech now again, you'd have to have really, really good reason to flip back again. So I don't see that ever happening through the Supreme Court. I could maybe see there being some limiting of it to kind of narrowly change how it's applied, so it's a little narrower, so it's not nearly as broad. But I don't think that we'll see the Supreme Court taking action on it. Any change is going to have to be through probably a constitutional amendment. Bloomin, what if a corporation partly owned by a foreign national spends money on any election? Ugh, I love this question. I've actually written to the FEC about this question. That's why I love it. Yes. What if a corporation partly owned by foreign nationals spends money on any election? What if members of the board are foreign nationals? So that's a great question, and I've actually written to the FEC about this because they actually have special rules and a system to kind of analyze this. So the answer is that the corporation can, but the foreign nationals may not have any control or decision-making authority or otherwise be part of the decision to make that contribution or make that independent expenditure. So sometimes what will happen is the board will, if there's a majority of United States citizens on the board, then what they'll do is that the board, without the foreign nationals voting or discussing, will create a specific committee, and that specific committee will then make all the decisions related to electoral activity. If they don't, then what will happen is the board will elect a committee, will essentially appoint or elect a committee of all United States citizens, and then that committee will then elect another different board to then run or make the decisions over the election activities. So there's also all kinds of things related to, well, what if there's a foreign national who supervises someone who sits on those committees? So then they implicitly have power of that person and can fire them, and so there's all kinds of rules about ensuring that there's no, it's an obnoxious process that's overcomplicated perhaps, but also there for good reason. And it can seem like a lot, but the answer is that the good news, there is no influence, even if it's a foreign corporation, or there are individuals on the board who are on the board who are foreign nationals. But there's a lot of administrative work that goes into that to ensuring compliance with that rule. So, do super PACs have to disclose their contributors? So technically, yes. And I say technically because there are situations, so yeah. Super PACs do have to, like any PAC, has to disclose their donors if they reach a certain threshold. But on the other hand, we also have politically active nonprofits, such as 501c4 social welfare organizations. Those organizations are allowed to be politically active as long as it's not their primary purpose. Now, the FEC, IRS has determined that primary purpose is like 49.99999%. And even then, I think they've been a little loose there sometimes with that. So donors to 501c4 organizations aren't disclosed. So you'll get a bunch of donations to a 501c4 organization, this politically active nonprofit. This political active nonprofit will then make a donation to a super PAC. So you'll have $1 million going to this nonprofit and $1 million going to the super PAC, and the only disclosure you see is the name of the 501c4 organization. You never see the actual donor's name. So I say technically yes, but kind of not really, depending on the situation. Now, in theory, you're not supposed to create a 501c4 organization for the sole purpose of circumventing this law of disclosure, but, I mean, there's a lot of 501c4 organizations making donations. Just want to see time. So I'm going to try and figure out which one of these. Okay. That one's blank. Can't big media companies resulting in so much repetition turn off voters to candidate or issues? Yes. I mean, there is such a thing as, exhaustion from news and activist exhaustion. So people will repeatedly see information constantly and then it's kind of like boiling the frog, where they'll see it so much they've kind of become they no longer react the same way to it. So yeah, that's possible. Let's see. Since people always seem to find a way to use money to influence elections, should they be focused on restricting money or mandating transparency? Yes. I would say always start with mandating transparency, because that has just been flat out held constitutional by the Supreme Court. There is only one justice who's ever disagreed with that. Otherwise, it's 8 justices all agree, yes, you can require people to make disclosures. So transparency is always like the easiest path towards tracking money in politics and kind of being able to work against that influence. The other side is restricting money. So as we've seen with the Supreme Court cases, that's really not that's got a lot of constitutional limitations to it. So that's probably your biggest struggle, is trying to find ways where that's constitutional to do limitations. And for the most part, you're gonna run into some problems. The only way you're gonna be able to really do more restriction of money in politics again is if you have a constitutional amendment overturning Citizens United and its particular logic, which I know is not the answer you wanted to hear, but that's the truth of it. I think that's it. Thank you so much for your time.